Woof woof. Hello, welcome to another video. My name is Kat. I'm definitely a cat person, no pun intended. But today we have another film recommendation for you in this video, and that is Wes Anderson's 2018 stop animation film, Isle of Dogs, and welcome to this video. To give a few quick facts about this movie before we begin about our thoughts and what we thought about the movie, it was nominated for the Best Animated Feature in 2018, but however it lost to Into the Spider-Verse. You can have your own opinions about that. It's got a stellar cast, like with most studio-made, animation films. And unlike most movies about pets, this is a movie told from generally the dog's perspective, where the dogs all think like humans and talk to each other like humans. And it is set in Japan. Have we mentioned that? It's just where the story is set. While the movie was released in 2018, production began as early as 2015, over 2.5 years earlier. It required a lot of time to build the characters, and not to mention the numerous sets that appear in the movie. To give a quick synopsis about this movie, Isle of Dogs takes place in an alternate version of Japan, and it is when humanity has decided we hate dogs and sent all the dogs basically to this trash island, where they basically live now and have been for 6 months, until one day a 12-year-old boy named Atari decides to go on this island and look for his own dog. And there he meets a group of other dogs, and they together embark on the journey of a lifetime that will decide the fate of dogs, canines, and humans as we know it.
I want to quickly talk about Wes Anderson's directing style before I talk about anything else. Wes Anderson's directing style is known by this big concept called fascist aesthetic. To put it in the simpler term, it basically means that he likes his set designs to be in an orderly manner, where everything is placed intentionally at a specific angle or location in order to make the scene as perfectly, as beautiful, and as aesthetic as possible. This is why in a lot of his movies, you can see how the protagonist or the characters are standing in the middle of the film, and the background, the left side, always mirrors the right side. So it's a very beautifully, perfectly portrayed aesthetic. Some people really hate it, some people really love it. I personally don't mind it at all. I just think it gives me a fresh view comparing to the modern films or contemporary films that often emphasize on naturalism or realistic presentation of characters and setting. So I think his aesthetic and his style is quite unique in comparison. Another element that you can find in a lot of his movies is the fact that he uses a storybook structure to tell the story. So when we read fictions, we often see chapter 1, stage 1, phase 1, and then it goes on to chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5. His movies really just feels like a continuation of multiple segments that happen in different times and locations as the story progresses, which gives his movie an overall faster pacing. I find this to be quite interesting because he is basically bringing in the structure of another medium, which is novels and fictions, into his movies. You can also see this storybook structure in many of his other films like Fantastic Mr. Fox, The Grand Budapest Hotel. I think Moonrise Kingdom does it too, but I'm not too sure. So you can go check that out. Now let's talk a little bit about the messages and themes of this movie. So something that you have to keep in mind when you watch this film is that this is an animation made for adults. So there are some dark elements or dark humor in this film that most children probably won't be able to realize. So this includes how when the dogs are battling each other, the scene is actually quite gruesome because a dog bit off another dog's ear. So there's actually like human injury there if you really think about that perspective, since dogs are seen as human in that film. So it's quite scary. And also on their trip to find Spot, which is a missing dog, they actually have to go through this factory that processes like combustion. Like they have to travel through this factory that is like full of toxins or like combustible gases or something. So basically they're really likely to explode in that factory and die. So it's quite dark. Also how there are people who are trying to poison them with gas and kill them all. Even just the setting of Trash Island itself is quite scary because there are literally bugs everywhere and they're trash piling on top of each other. They're like greasy oil like streaming down without any clean water. All the dogs are injured in somewhere. A lot of times they're fur is falling off, so you see their bare skin with a lot of red splotches of blood. So there are a lot of creepy scenes in this movie, but because this is an animation and because this is a story about dog, all of these things just seem less scary all of a sudden. And it just appears to be dark humor instead of just horror. Another interpretation that people have is saying that a lot of the scenes are reflecting or hinting at the history of the Holocaust. In this film, we can see that the dogs are basically the minority groups, or the weaker, the most vulnerable group, who are discriminated and marginalized against in this film. The rest of the country, or the rest of the city, basically united together as the majority, thinking that they're self-righteous and they have a claim to basically abandon or even kill this group of people, which are dogs. This is why I also agree that I do realize these association with World War II. Another evidence that points to this historic event is the fact that in the end of the movie, the dogs are facing the threat of being placed in a gas chamber, but instead of a chamber, they're basically put behind a fence, which forbids them to leave the island, and that there are people who are really tall and dressed in black suits, looking very authoritative, like bring their gas tanks and basically try to kill them with their gas. Obviously, this is hinting at the gas chambers that happened, and the trash island can be seen as a form of concentration camp. Something to note is that Wes Anderson is not known to produce thematically strong films, even though I personally see a lot of themes related to politics, but this film is not thematically heavy on politics either. Because of the children, of the dogs that are involved, it just makes everything a lot more childish, a lot more sweeter, and lighthearted to watch. For me, I see an underlying message or plot development about political madness, how there's a combat or struggle of power between two parties, which are the dog lovers and the cat lovers. Initially, the dog lovers are at the bottom, the cat lovers are at the top, because the dog lovers, like the scientist or Antari, the little boy, the American exchange students, or the dogs themselves, they're always neglected, and their voices are never valued because they're children or they're dogs, and the cat lovers are empowered. And they're mostly empowered because of corruption. And eventually the theme of revolt and rebellion against this power becomes more obvious as these minority groups or the weaker groups start to climb their way up and fight against the cat lovers, and the cat lovers loses and they go to jail, and now the dog lovers are empowered. So I see this transformation of power, the theme of revolt, and the theme of just political madness and dictatorship as well. That's the darker side of the film. On the brighter side of the film, you can also see the development of genuine human connection or dog connection, or the connection between a dog and its master, which is the human, Antari. So we can see the growth of Chief, which is the protagonist within the dogs. If we put him into a human perspective, we can see that he is a very defensive human because he has never been loved before, and he feels like he has to act tough all the time in order to protect himself. And gradually his wall just tumbles down as Antari, shows love, bathe him, feed him food, trains him, and eventually Chief develops this loyalty, this love and connection with the little boy Antari. On the brighter side, you can say that this film is about creating that relationship and genuine connection. If you are a very cynical person, you might see how Chief has basically lost his identity and he has given up his freedom and free will in exchange for a sense of security and stability, which is what a lot of people do when they're facing a dictatorship. Instead of choosing to fight back against the dictatorship, they choose to surrender their own power for an exchange in peace and stability.
And I think lastly, it's also important that we look at the criticism surrounding this film and how was it received. Well, on Rotten Tomatoes, it received a 90% critic score and an 87 audience score. So generally, compared to most films, it was an A+. Well, not A+, but it was generally an A. It was a good movie.
Ask me to fetch that.
However, Wes Anderson for this movie has received also a lot of other criticism surrounding whether it should be or could be considered culturally insensitive. The director has said in an interview that he doesn't believe that this story has any specific correlations or connections to the culture of Japan. Then, well, in that case, why was it filmed? Why was it set in Japan? Personally, when I was first watching this movie and when the opening scene started, I immediately thought that it was a Japanese anime and that it was dubbed or translated into English instead. But no, the film was intended for a Western audience. And so, when the story doesn't have anything to do with Japanese history, yet the director wanted to portray this culture, what does that say about Western media and how we perceive cultures, and especially cultures other than our own, in terms of what we deem as art, what we deem as acceptable, and what we deem as cultural appropriation. So I guess there's no black or white answers about it. In the movie, a lot of the characters speak in Japanese. However, what they say in Japanese was never translated into English. So, especially since this movie was intended for a generally English-speaking audience, the fact that a lot of the times the audience wouldn't even know what the characters are saying, I think raises a lot of questions and a lot of criticism in this sense. And I think I have to agree. If something the characters are saying in Japanese, if it's not translated, does that just mean that it's less important? And I think this aspect unconsciously passes on the idea that, well, if something that is not translated, that just means that it's less important. And that is not even to mention that in the plot of the story, something that really rubbed me the wrong way was that the main savior outside of Antari and the dogs was this American girl who stood up to the corrupt government in Japan. And so it's just portraying the idea that in order for, a foreign country outside of the States to improve upon its current state, whether it be social reform or political reform, it needs a westernized voice and a westernized hero to start that revolution, and it is the United States. That, you get what I'm saying? And if the story is set in Japan, why can't just Antari be the clear hero? While this is most definitely a hero story, there is no clear protagonist. There are a lot of characters that could pass as protagonists. It could be Atari, it could be Spots in a way, it could be the dogs. And I think that just leaves a lot up for discussion, because especially with a Wes Anderson film, I think a lot of times he chooses to portray his story through a slightly more artistic, abstract, if not ambiguous lens. And think of that what you will. And I think in most cases that is a good thing. And in art, we like to discuss, and it's important that everybody has their own opinions, and I think discussion is good. To conclude, I want to propose the question and ask that, is this film for everyone? And I think, personally speaking, while this is a pretty fun superhero story that the plot is easy enough to follow, I personally don't believe that this is necessarily for every audience. While, say, a elementary school kid watched this movie, I think they would have a good time. And I think they would like the characters for what they are, they would like the fun graphics. However, I think because the message of this movie is not so obvious, and while there is no, it is definitely not like a fairy tale where there's a strong moral to the story, I think in order to fully understand this movie and what the directors are trying to say, not only is discussion needed, I think you have to dig deeper in order to sort of try to interpret the symbolism and the stylistic choices that the director has made in order to understand what this movie truly is about. If there is one thing this movie is about, which I would argue that it isn't. We've talked about this movie a lot before we started filming this video, and I think a good movie definitely warrants a good discussion, and it's almost as if discussion is more important than the original film itself. And I think that even though it is not the only testament for a good piece of art or a good movie or a good story, but I think good stories and good films definitely warrant that discussion. So in that aspect, I definitely think Isle of Dogs succeeded, and there's so much to unpack here, and what we've talked about in this video is only just scratching the surface.
In case you haven't realized, I am a person with a lot of opinions and a lot of things to talk about, so please let me know what you think about this movie if you have watched it in the comment section. And if you want us to do other film reviews, recommendations, or our opinions, just let us know what the name of the movie is, and then we'll go watch it and we'll tell you if it's worthwhile to watch or not. And we'll see you next time.